Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
I sincerely hope that I do not offend anybody by my remarks tonight. That's not my goal. I have many friends, I have students, I have friends who are students, all of whom are strong believers, and I do not want to jeopardize those relationships or to suggest that I disrespect them for their beliefs. I support in the strongest terms the right of anyone to believe anything they want to believe as long as they don't act on those beliefs in a way that harms others. I'm in full support of the spectrum of beliefs that we have here at Williams, and I'm in full support of an event like the Veritas Forum and discussions like the one that we're going to have tonight. There are many ways that we can divide humanity into subgroups. We can subdivide ourselves into Democrats and Republicans, or men and women, or heterosexuals and homosexuals, or for tonight's purposes, believers and non-believers. But by that last option, our audience tonight splits, and I'm on one side of this issue from a different side from many of the people in this room. On the other hand, we could also subdivide humanity into those who are interested in thinking about the big questions and those who are not. And by that subdivision, the very fact that you're here tonight suggests you're on the same side of that divide as I am. For as long as I can remember, I've always been interested in the big questions. Is there a God? Is there a greater meaning to life? Where does morality come from? Is there an afterlife? I find those questions fascinating, much more interesting than whether or not Team X from City A will beat Team Y from City B in the finals of Sport Z this year. That just never did it for me. On the other hand, the honest truth is that I've had very few of these conversations over the years, and there are two reasons for that. First, many people take great umbrage if they feel that you are questioning their beliefs. Personally, I'm never offended if someone questions my religious beliefs, because my entire life I myself have been questioning them. And the way I do all my beliefs. And I hope that I will continue to learn and modify my beliefs throughout my life. And by being here, I hope you also are open to changing your beliefs about whatever subject. So as mentioned, this last January, I taught a winter study course on atheism. And one of the readings from that course was chosen by one of the students, and it was by Bertrand Russell. And it was an interesting piece. One of the things that Russell said, which struck a chord with many of us, was that if an opinion contradicts your own and it makes you angry, then probably subconsciously you know that there is little basis for your own opinion. For example, if somebody says, well, France is next to China, you don't get angry. You may feel sorry for them, especially if they continue to believe this fact in spite of evidence to the contrary, but you don't get angry. The second reason that I've had very few of these kinds of conversations over the years is that admitting that you do not believe in God can have negative consequences. In a 1999 Gallup poll, when asked whether they would vote for a presidential candidate that was otherwise qualified but was from certain groups, what percentage of respondents said no? Well, if the candidate was Catholic, 4% said they would not vote for them, even if otherwise they were perfectly qualified. If they were African Americans, 5% said they would not vote for them. If they were Jewish, 6% would not vote for them. If they were a woman, 8% would not vote for them. If they were gay, 37% would not vote for them. If they were Muslim, 38% would not vote for them. And then if they were atheist, 48% would not vote for them. And I would hate it if the parents of my children's friends did not allow their kids to come over to our house for fear of being infected by me and my godless ways. And I honestly believe that this does happen. Many people don't trust atheists. People believe that if you're godless, this means that you have no morals. Well, I'm happy to report that is not true. Okay? I'm also happy to say that I think these attitudes are changing. That data that I mentioned, well, that's 10 years old now. I think people, at least in an academic town like this one, are becoming more accepting of others who not only don't believe the same set of religious tenets they do, but do not believe, in fact, in any God. Now, I'm a skeptic by nature. If someone tells me some supposed truth, I want to see the evidence. I hate to be fooled. For things that are less believable, I tend to initially disbelieve them until I see the evidence. If somebody at lunch someday, we have these lunches in the math department, if somebody at lunch says, did you know that a single rat can have 1 million descendants in 18 months? I want to hear the details, okay? I want to see if that's really possible. How old do rats have to be to give birth? What's the gestation period? How many litters can they have per year? How big is a litter? I'm not going to believe that pronouncement by experts or authority figures. I'm not going to believe it. I don't think it should be accepted just on the basis of their credentials. I want to see the evidence. And that's a healthy attitude. It's the basis for all of science. It should be the basis for all of politics. It's not, but it should be. Do not believe the so-called experts. See for yourself. Question every assumption. It's the basis of intellectual inquiry, both at a place like Williams and at a place like MIT. So I became very skeptical of religious claims very early. The evidence was too often this personal experience of God, which number one, I didn't have, and number two, seemed much too easy to convince yourself it was an experience of God when it wasn't. And when people said, you just have to have faith, well, that was the clincher. To me, saying you must have faith is a way of saying you should accept this fact, the existence of God, without supporting evidence. And I'm incapable of doing that. So by the age of 12, I was a confirmed atheist. My friend Bruce and I, we formed Atheists Anonymous in 6th grade. And since that time, my belief that there is no God has only strengthened. So I'm an atheist, but let me clarify what I mean by that. I cannot say unequivocally that no God exists. There may be a God. What I mean when I say that I believe no God exists is that based on the evidence, or rather lack thereof, I believe the probability of God's existence is extremely small. I also believe that there's not a pink Cheshire cat hiding under that chair right there. I can't prove that it isn't there, and if I look there, he might have moved. He might be very quick. He might be able to make himself invisible. But I can say that it is extremely unlikely that he is there. I can say that I have seen no evidence for the fact that he is there. But I do leave open the possibility that there is a God out there. And this is what most people mean when they say they are atheists, including people like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett. All of them admit that they cannot prove, in the mathematical sense of prove, that there is no God. On the other hand, there are lots and lots of people who are at the other end of the belief spectrum who do not say that they believe probabilistically that there is no God. They say they know there is no God, and nothing could possibly convince them otherwise. They know it in their heart. Doesn't matter to them if their God, who is supposedly benevolent and all-loving, lets hundreds of thousands of people drown in a tsunami, or lets thousands of helpless children be buried alive in an earthquake, trapped underground until they die. Doesn't matter that he lets millions of people die of debilitating, horrible, excruciatingly painful diseases in torment and agony. Why would he do that? But they explain it away by saying it is not for us to try to understand God's motives. He has his reasons. We wouldn't accept that answer for any human actions. Why do we accept it here? No, there is no evidence that would convince them that there is no God. As a general rule, from my perspective, anything you're convinced of with that level of certainty should be suspect. You should question yourself and say, why am I so sure? Now you can ask the same thing of me. What could convince me that there is a God? Well, in the winter study course, this was a topic that we talked about, and we asked, what evidence would it take to change your mind? And one student came up with the following. Suppose you lost a limb, and someone came to you and prayed for you to regenerate that limb, and in that instant, while they were praying, the limb grew back. Well, that would be pretty impressive. And it's impressive because limbs do not grow back naturally, right? And in all the history of all the faith healers that anybody's ever heard about, not once has a faith healer been able to do exactly that feat, to get a limb that has been detached, to get the limb to grow back. So that would certainly get me thinking. If studies were done, reproducible studies that showed that prayer by outside parties could heal people that didn't know whether or not they were being prayed for, whether or not they were in the control group, well, that would get me thinking. I mean, I definitely take that very seriously. But in fact, studies have found the opposite. Or if it were true that there was a single religion that seemed to have its prayers answered all the time over all the other religions, well, that would get me in that church's door pretty quick. But that doesn't happen. Or maybe if a giant hand reached through the ceiling right now, grabbed me by the shirt, hauled me up high in the air, and a voice said, okay, enough of this nonsense, I exist. That would do the trick. That would definitely be the trick. But now let's talk a little bit about evidence. I'm a mathematician, but I didn't start out that way. I was always good at math, but it wasn't until college that I started to truly appreciate it. I actually started out as a philosophy major, and this was at MIT. But I did philosophy because I thought that philosophy was the field that had the answers to the big questions. And I quickly came to the realization that it did not have those answers. But then I discovered mathematics. And what is great about mathematics is that you're either right or you're wrong. There is no in between. Either Teichmüller space is negatively curved or it's not. And personality plays a tiny role in mathematics. It's not who you get along with or who you kiss up to. It's about the theorems that you prove. And they're right or wrong independent of anyone's opinion about them or opinion about you. It's entirely based on rigor and on proof. If you cannot rigorously prove that something is true, then you cannot claim it to be true. And I just loved that. This is not to say that intuition doesn't play a role. It does. It's critically important. Intuition points you in the direction that hopefully leads to the correct results. But regardless of what your intuition says, you must then prove the result. You would never rely on your intuition to prove something. I mean, you can imagine those theorems. Theorem, Teichmüller space is negatively curved. Proof. I'm pretty sure. It feels right to me. Or how about, I was told that it was true in a dream. Or, it says it is true in this ancient text without proof. I'm not talking about Euclid's Elements. It says it is true in this ancient text, but no proof. But that's not going to fly in mathematics. Now, I think I have a pretty good intuition, mathematically speaking, but even though that's true, it often leads me completely astray. I will be completely convinced that something's going to be true. It just feels right, and I'm so sure it's going to work. But then I spend a week trying to prove it, and at the end of the week, I find a counterexample. It's just not true. So I have learned not to base my results on my intuition. It can point me in a fruitful direction, but that is all it can do. So neither would I base my beliefs about whether or not there is a God on, it just feels right, or it makes me feel good to believe in God, or on my intuition. My intuition is governed by all kinds of subjective phenomena. Chemicals in my brain, how well I slept, my emotional state, evolutionary layers of my mind laid upon who knows what foundation. No, I want evidence. If God exists, that is a statement about an attribute of the universe. And I don't just mean the space-time universe, I mean everything that exists. That is a statement about what exists. And if God exists, either he or she, I'm just going to use he here, either he has a direct impact on human affairs or he does not. If he does not, then in fact it becomes somewhat irrelevant that he is there. You can still discuss the question, but if there's no difference for anyone or anything, whether or not he's there, the question becomes merely philosophical with no further implications. Certainly the religious gods that are prayed to in the primary religions are supposed to have an impact on human affairs. So let's focus on that kind of God. If he has an impact, then we should be able to measure that impact. Whether or not there is a God is a scientifically testable hypothesis. Now, some people claim that the existence of God is not a scientific question. They say, as Stephen Jay Gould said, that science and religion are distinct magisteria, non-overlapping. These two areas do not overlap. But clearly, historically, this is false. Science has dramatically changed the way most people view God. The vast majority of educated people today no longer believe that the earth and everything on it was created 10,000 years ago. Many people no longer believe that God created man as he stands today and all the creatures as they now appear. Hardly anybody believes that the sun is a golden chariot being ridden by a god across the sky. Science has a huge impact on religious views and on the possibilities for God. Okay, so now what I'd like to do is turn very quickly to look at the evidence for God. Well, one of the things that people point out as evidence for God is that essentially every major religion in history has believed in a god or gods. So shouldn't we take that collective viewpoint as strong evidence that there's a god or gods out there? Well, of course, we can't go by what a lot of those religions believed. After all, we've rejected what 99% of those religions in history have said. And as far as those past gods go, we're all atheists. We don't believe in Zeus or Poseidon, any of those. In the Bible, there are specific descriptions of the Genesis story, Adam and Eve, the Garden of Eden, and for most people, those descriptions are no longer accepted as anything more than allegory. Similarly for the Quran. For thousands and thousands of years, people believed that thunder and lightning were temper tantrums of the gods. To this day, people, intelligent people, believe that the movement of stars govern their lives and that they make decisions accordingly. So let's not go with the majority opinion. It really hasn't served us so well over the years. Another form of evidence comes in the form of prophets who report to us that they have heard the word of God and God has told them how we should live our lives. But this has always confused me. How do you decide amongst the thousands of individuals who have claimed to be prophets spouting the word of God, which is the right one? My gosh, tons of them have performed miraculous feats testified to by others. Tons of them have had meaningful messages for humanity and have espoused moral codes that are worthy of following. There are some even alive today who have millions of followers. How do you decide which one to follow? Do you pick the one that has the most followers? Go with the majority? As I mentioned before, that seems risky at best. Go with the belief system that you were born into? That's what most people do. But do you really believe that you were lucky enough to have been born into the one true religion? Look around you, because probabilistically speaking, you were not. A third form of evidence, which is perhaps the most common, is I have experienced God in my life. I've had a personal epiphany, a special moment. Well, I can't answer that. I haven't had that moment. And if that is the individual evidence that you're basing your belief on, then yes, a belief in God can be a rational conclusion derived out of that experience. Because no one but you has experienced what you have experienced. But truthfully, if I were basing my belief in God on such an experience, I would worry that the human mind is entirely capable of fooling itself. As an example, when I was in graduate school, I once thought that I saw a ghost. I woke up in the middle of the night, and it was sitting on the chair at the end of my bed, and he had on a bowler hat, and he had on clothes from the 1890s, and he was sitting there, and I could make out all the details of this guy who was sitting at the end of my bed, and he was just staring at me. And I just closed my eyes and went back to sleep. And in the morning, he was gone. Now, if I were naive, I would believe today that I saw a ghost. It was very convincing. But we understand better all the time how the mind attempts to see patterns everywhere and to interpret them and to make sense of the input that it receives. Transcendent moments could just as easily be generated in a variety of ways. Why assume that it is a message from God? Another version of personal experience of God is to say that God answers my prayers. Well, again, not much I can say here except what does basic probability tell us? Let's say, for example, I fall in love with someone and I want her to love me back. Now, this happened to me in 5th grade. In 5th grade, I fell in love with a girl. Terry Mellon was her name, and I just thought she was the most special person I'd ever met, a very special 5th grader. And so for the next 3 days and 3 nights, I prayed to God. And I said to God, please, God, make Terry Mellon love me. And if you do, I promise I will believe in you for the rest of my life. And on the 4th day, I went to school, and she came up to me, and she handed me a note and 3 pieces of bubble gum. And on the note, it said, I really like you. And I thought to myself, oh no, does this mean I have to believe in God? But I later found out that she had given notes and gum to 2 other boys that same night. So I decided the deal was off. But the important point here is that if an event has, let's say, a 25% chance of happening without divine intervention, and I pray to God for help, and 75% of the time it doesn't happen, and 25% of the time it does, and I ascribe the times that it does happen to God every time, no wonder that I believe. Let me give you another example. When the tsunami hit the Indian Ocean in 2004, I'm guessing that just about everyone who was involved in that was praying for salvation. The hundreds of thousands who died did not have their belief in God strengthened. They're gone. But those who survived saw the immense odds they overcame and said to themselves, it's a miracle. God answered my prayers. Even though we know from the outside that some number of people are going to survive such an event, and no input from God is necessary to make that happen. So ironically enough, in these horrible disasters, which you would think would convince people there cannot be a benevolent God, actually often have the opposite effect of increasing the percentage of believers, at the very least amongst those individuals who experience it. So I do not believe in God. I wish I could. I'd love to be able to take comfort in the idea of a father figure who's covering my back and who'll help me in my direst moment of need. But wishing that something is true doesn't make it true. I also wish that I could solve the Riemann hypothesis. But wishing it to be true doesn't make it true. It would make more sense for me to spend my time working on the problem instead of spending that time praying for a supernatural being to telegraphically give me the answer. Now, I very quickly, because I don't want to go too long here, I'm already going too long, I want to turn to a separate issue, and that is religion itself. I want to talk about that just a little bit. I do believe that religious organizations do a lot of good. They provide a structured system for supporting those in need and for giving solace and emotional support to many. However, I am in complete agreement with Sam Harris, who argues that religion also often takes the focus away from the moral issues that should concern us most. Now, what are those moral issues? I believe, as he does, that it is to alleviate suffering. I believe that we should do everything we can to eliminate starvation, poverty, war, homelessness, suffering of any kind. We should strive to create conditions where each human being has enough resources to be able to pursue happiness in whatever way they see fit, as long as it does not harm others. I want that right for myself, I want it for my children, I want it for my neighbors, and I want it for everyone else on the planet who I will never meet. That should be the goal. But religions often put the emphasis on other more peripheral issues. Issues like gay marriage, like stem cell research, like abstinence-only sex education, like keeping women out of the power structure of churches, for instance. Wouldn't it be great if all the resources spent on concerns with regard to these activities, which oftentimes prevent people from attaining happiness, were spent instead on feeding the needy, helping them get jobs and homes? This is the problem with established religion. It often thwarts moral advance, and it can also be abused. As Steven Weinberg said, with or without religion, you would have good people doing good things and evil people doing evil things. But for good people to do evil things, that takes religion. Accepted morality evolves over time. Opinions change. Nowadays, no civilized person would accept slavery. But religions hinder that forward advancement. If we have to keep referring to books that are thousands of years old for our morality, we see very little advancement. The church has slowed down progress. Why should we put up with that? Don't base your morality on what was believed true 2,000 years ago. Make up your own mind. So does my life have meaning without God? You bet. I'm bringing up 2 children as moral human beings, and I'm tremendously proud of both of them. I love watching them grow up. And I find the world a fascinating place. I understand that this incredibly complex world came about over millions and millions of years of natural selection. So many millions of years that it is almost impossible for us to comprehend. So sometimes it seems easier to throw up our hands and say, well, it could only have come from God. But don't underestimate millions of years. And I find mathematics absolutely fascinating. I love spending my time trying to uncover new mathematics. I love talking about mathematics with my students. It's a constant source of fascination and wonder. And I feel incredibly lucky to be alive and to have found my vocation. And I don't believe in an afterlife, so this is it. So I need to make the most of it. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be with you tonight. I had a moment or two to wander through your beautiful, the grounds of your campus. It's not quite like this in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but we have our own advantages too. I'm going to keep my remarks quite brief. I'm going to try to keep to the 15-minute guidance. And I want to therefore just in a certain sense lay out in the boldest of terms some ideas which I think will then get the discussion going, and I'm sure we'll have a chance to have some give and take thereafter. First of all, I want to start with a couple of disclaimers. First, I haven't got the slightest interest or anything approaching the competency to defend all religions or religion in general. I mean, obviously the religious impulse is essentially universal to humankind. There's a lot to be said for treating other people's beliefs seriously, as I believe that Professor Adams does. But it seems completely clear to me that the teachings of different religions are simply incompatible with one another in lots of cases, and that therefore some of them cannot be true. Now, I believe in Jesus, and so the religious belief that I'm going to be recommending is Christianity, and I suppose there's no surprises there. Second disclaimer. I think Christianity is true, but I don't feel any compulsion to defend everything that has been done in its name. In fact, I will immediately stipulate that some very foolish and some very bad things have been done in the name of Christ. Christians are very imperfect individuals, like everybody else. Christian churches are very imperfect social organizations, just like every other organization, and that's what Christianity has always taught. Okay, so with those disclaimers, let me start. The starting presupposition, I would claim, for most arguments in the intellectual West today is that there is no reality beyond what is discoverable by natural science, and that there is no authority or good higher than the freedom of the individual. Both science and individual freedom are very good, but Christians have a different view. We believe that both the deepest reality and the highest moral meaning and authority are found in loving relationship. We believe that this universe exists because a God whose nature is love, expressed in relationship, has willed it and loves it. We believe that individuals are loved by God and find their true fulfillment in entering willingly into a relationship with Him and into loving relationships with one another. Now, of course, we can see around us that everything is not love. That's very plain. There's a great deal of pain, alienation, anger, strife, and war. Christians believe that God has entered into the experience of His creation in the person of a human, Jesus, and that He's taken upon Himself the suffering and alienation of the world at great cost and overcome it. We believe that this stupendous redeeming act took place in history in front of practically the whole population of a small country, and that the result echoes up and down the centuries. Now, if this Christian view is true, how would one go about confirming it? The militant atheists of today that Professor Adams has referred to, whose books are on the bestsellers list, tell us that there is no evidence for Christianity or for theism generally. But I would say that their assertion rests on an unfounded position that the only evidence that counts comes from the application of the methods of science. So, for example, Richard Dawkins, in his book, The God Delusion, says, "Did Jesus raise Lazarus from the dead? Did he himself come alive again 3 days after being crucified? There is an answer to every such question, whether or not we can discover it in practice, and it is strictly a scientific answer. The methods we should use to settle the matter would be purely and entirely scientific methods." He says the same thing in about 6 or 7 other places in the book. But this is really silly. I mean, I'm an applied physicist. I have tremendous respect for and experience with the power and rigor of science in deciding questions about the natural world. But the questions that Dawkins has posed there are not questions about nature. They're questions about history. Just replace one of those questions, for example, by was Julius Caesar stabbed to death on the steps of the Roman Senate on the 15th of March in 44 BC? Would it make sense to say that the only way to settle this question would be by purely and entirely scientific methods, as Richard Dawkins would have it? No. We need methods appropriate to the claim that's being made. Now, the evidence that we seek for historical claims isn't scientific evidence by and large, it's historical evidence. And this will be predominantly documentary. It might be personal and maybe even eyewitness testimony. There might be some archaeological evidence. There might indeed be forensic scientific evidence, although it's pretty unlikely for things as old as the murder of Caesar, or for that matter, the events of the New Testament. And this would all be gathered together, taking into account our general understanding of how things tick, and of course the background knowledge that historians have of how the society of the day worked and what the attitudes of people in those days were. So it's very important, I think, when we're talking about evidence and reason, to shake off the very frequent presumption that the only convincing evidence is scientific. That's not true when you're talking about religious belief, but it's also not true when you're talking about a lot of other things, and I've given the example of history. So what is the historical evidence for the Christian claims that Jesus was the Son of God, that he lived the life of an itinerant preacher and healer, that he was barbarically executed by the Romans at the behest of the religious leaders of his own country, whom he had criticized and offended and embarrassed, that he rose again from the dead, and that his transformed followers spread the news throughout the world and eventually transformed it. Another of the atheist authors, Christopher Hitchens, evidently thinks not much evidence. He refers, for example, to the highly questionable existence of Jesus, although he concedes that there might be oblique reason for thinking that some such personality may at some time have lived. But this is more silly nonsense. The overwhelming conclusion of historians, not just Christian historians, and indeed practically anyone else who's taken the question seriously, is that Jesus certainly was a person in history whose life actually is better documented than practically anyone else in first century Palestine. The manuscripts we have, for example, of the New Testament are extraordinarily early and complete. We have fragments, documentary fragments from the first 2 centuries. We have a complete New Testament from about 350 AD, and we have thousands of manuscripts later than that. These far surpass the documentary standards of typical classical works. For example, Caesar's Gallic War, the writings of Julius Caesar about his campaign in Gaul, it has extant only about 10 manuscripts, of which the earliest comes from 900 years after the event. So by commonly accepted academic standards, the New Testament is extraordinarily well documented. So one must, I think, if one is thoughtful, concede that Jesus was clearly a well-attested historical character. Now, of course, that's not to concede that he was the Son of God. Is it in fact reasonable to believe that? Isn't it more reasonable to believe that he was a deep spiritual thinker, a moral exemplar, a charismatic preacher, whose teachings we might follow or try to emulate, but about whom his followers deluded themselves into making up fancy tales? Now, this, of course, is a charge that's been made since the first century. It doesn't really hold much water for a lot of reasons that have been written about in scores and probably hundreds of books over the succeeding centuries. But I can mention only a couple of points. One telling point in my mind, is that Jesus made such outrageous and self-aggrandizing claims about himself and his relationship to God. If those claims that he made of his oneness with God, of being the Son of God and so forth, if those claims were false, then he was certainly actually not a good man. He was a charlatan or worse, or else he was completely insane. This is not my argument. This is a very old argument. It's been around for a long time. But I think it's an interesting, an important argument. Another point concerns the factual resurrection of Jesus. The risen Christ was witnessed by hundreds of individuals, and they subsequently lived out their lives with a kind of consistent conviction that he was indeed raised. This could not have been a mere moment of group delusion. It was not, at any rate, because they lived for the rest of their lives in that conviction. So certainly, at the very least, we can be sure that these people were sincere. The sincerity of their belief, of course, doesn't make it correct, but the message of the resurrection was the main message of the early Christians. And it does mean, their sincerity in that does mean that their witness should be taken seriously. And what it also means is that it's highly implausible, in my view, to argue that one can explain the testimony to the resurrection in terms of a deliberate fraud by the disciples, which was one of the other early accusations. It doesn't make psychological sense, in my view. One of the more surprising charges that have been leveled by the recent radical atheists and critics of religion is that religion is evil, that it poisons everything, that in a certain sense religion is immoral. Actually, even this charge isn't terribly innovative, because first and second century Christians were accused completely spuriously of being immoral and being cannibals, for example, and promoting human sacrifice. But anyway, the claims of today's militant atheists don't go further than that, but they do go further than the accusation of more recent history. So, of course, we're all familiar with Karl Marx's view that religion is the opiate of the people, lulling them into a kind of conformity with oppressive capitalism. But even atheists used not to go so far as to say that on balance, religion makes people do immoral things. That is the modern charge, and we heard it in the form of Weinberg's aphorism that Professor Adams read out to us. I've got 2 points to make about this modern moral assessment of religion, and then I'll end. The first is about the track record. I've conceded at the outset that Christianity's track record leaves a lot to be desired. It's fallen far short of its own aspirations and of those of any thoughtful person. But the important question when trying to assess the track record is really how good is it compared to what? Okay? This is not some kind of absolute question. It's got to be a relative question. And on this basis, it seems to me the arguments of Dawkins, Hitchens, Harris, and so forth are completely ludicrous. They recite the evils of the usual religious list, the Crusades, the Inquisition, the witch burnings, and so on, as evidence of the poisonousness of religion. And by the way, I'm not trying to excuse any of those things. Again, I've stipulated that the Christianity has done many evil things. But when then they come to talk about, or even think about, as they rarely do, the evils of atheism, which have been evidenced in horrifying plenitude by the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, well, they essentially gloss over it. They ignore or excuse them, or most fatuous of all, they inconsistently attribute them to religion, a kind of religion of Marxism or a kind of religion of atheism, trying to have it both ways. That makes no sense to me. I think it's a terrible argument, and it's not at all convincing. The truth is, and I'm grateful to hear Professor Adams say this, that Christianity has been and continues to be a great source of a great deal of good, sometimes indeed heroic good, and in my view, and I think the view of many other thinking people, including atheists, on balance it has had a better track record than any of the atheist alternatives. So that's the first thing. The second thing I want to say about the charge concerning the morality of Christianity is that if the standard of morality is, as I said at the beginning, the unfettered authority of individual autonomy, and as I've said, that this is, I believe, the presumption of the West these days, if the standard is, in other words, that I have the right to do what I want, provided it doesn't hurt anyone else, then I would say, yes, Christianity violates that moral code. By those lights, I would agree Christianity is immoral, because followers of Jesus think that loving relationship, not individual freedom, is the highest moral authority. In fact, we believe, paradoxically perhaps, that true individual freedom is found only in service to God and to our neighbor. Christians express this by saying that Jesus is Lord, by which they are affirming that their own personal individual preferences are subject to a higher authority than their own, or even than society's, and that higher authority is found in a loving relationship with God. Christians don't claim to be able always to live up to their ideals and aspirations. Indeed, the whole of Christianity is a recognition of the inability of humans to live up to those ideals and aspirations. But to have those ideals and aspirations is not hypocrisy. So finally, let me end by saying that since Christians say that the deepest significance lies in loving relationship with God, the test of Christianity isn't, in the end, simply an assessment of its efficacy as a social organizing force or a set of moral principles. And it certainly isn't whether the scientific laws are or are not sufficient to describe the world of nature. The test is, according to Christians, whether such a loving relationship is a reality or not. And this, I would affirm, is the true sense in which Christians say that their position is a position of faith. That faith is not the believing of 6 impossible things before breakfast. It's not believing what you know ain't true, or any of the other funny and sometimes not so funny caricatures of it. It is instead an experience that is personal, perhaps even mysterious, but not irrational. It's a loving relationship. And a relationship is not something that can, in the end, be completely encompassed by rational arguments. My love for my wife is something that can't be entirely encompassed in that way. I can't provide a scientific demonstration of it. I hope there's some evidence for it, but I do. But the relationship doesn't consist of the satisfaction of a certain set of scientific criteria. It has to be lived out on the basis of a faithful and trusting partnership. And in the same way, Christians say, and I say, you can't know God impersonally, but you can get to know him through a faithful, loving relationship with him. And that has been the Christian testimony down the centuries. Thank you very much.
First thing I would say is that I don't question that Jesus Christ was someone who did live at that time, and I realize there are some people who would argue that point. I wouldn't argue that point. I think there is enough evidence that says this was, in my mind, a human being that lived during that time period. As to whether or not he rose from the dead, as you were arguing, you said a lot of people said that they saw that he rose from the dead. They stuck with that testimony throughout their lives. That's great. However, there are so many examples of situations over the years where people have claimed similar miracles in completely different situations. Examples where they see statues that cry. There was a recent example in India where an entire town said that they saw Ganesh, the god, drinking milk out of all the containers, and everybody brought containers and held out their hands, and everybody testified to the fact that they saw that milk disappearing. And so we've had time and time and time again through history innumerable examples of situations very similar to the example that you're citing. And so I don't understand, and I guess what I'm asking is what makes this one case so different than all these other cases that we've seen for such a long time? So that's, maybe I should let you answer that question first.
Okay, miracles, interesting. First of all, I think that there is a uniqueness to the Christian claims that actually differentiates it from essentially all other religions, and I wouldn't want to go into. I wouldn't want to take the time to go into that in great detail. But certainly, it is certainly the case that the claim of the resurrection is a claim which is essentially unique, and it's not the same as my statue cried or my fifth grade sweetheart gave me bubble. Sorry about that. Sorry. But actually, I was intrigued by your recounting that story, and I would guess, and I have a story like that too. I have a story as a child of praying for something that was important to me. In my case, well, in your case, you received it, okay, which is rather interesting. In my case, I didn't receive it, and that convinced me that God did not exist. And so, I lived out my youth as a confirmed atheist. I didn't come from a religious background. But I think in both of these cases, what this shows is that personal miracles have a hard time persuading people to live out their lives consistently. And I think your story kind of demonstrated that too. And maybe mine demonstrates it also in the sense in that I'm not consistently an atheist either.
And let me just add one thing to that. In the example that I was talking about, I think in the case of a miracle where somebody gives you bubblegum, I agree. But in the case of the example of the tsunami, as I was mentioning, I think oftentimes people are convinced after they survive some horrible event like that there is a God, and that God was the person who saw them, was the being who saw them through that. And so it really can change their perspective for the rest of their lives. So I think that does happen. The other issue I wanted to bring up was this issue you brought up in talking about Christ, and saying that Christ, and this is something that we talked about in the winter study course, so it's something that we've had discussion of, Christ was either a madman or he was the Son of God. And you argued that this third possibility, which C.S. Lewis never mentions, is this possibility, or he was a bad man. And I mean, to me, it seems like, there were, at the time that Christ lived, there were a lot of people claiming to be prophets. And there were a lot of people in Jerusalem at that time that were claiming to be prophets. And it wasn't so easy to stand out as a prophet. And if you were to say to everyone, acknowledge that you're a human, you have no special access to God, it's going to be tough to attract a following. On the other hand, there is a tremendous incentive to say, well, actually, I can speak directly to God. I am the Son of God. And this was part and parcel, potentially, of why he was particularly successful as a prophet over other prophets. So I'm not saying that makes you a bad person. It just
makes you a charlatan, is what it is. And that's exactly what the argument is that we are not left with the option of treating Jesus as a great moral teacher. If he was not the Son of God, then he was at the very least a charlatan, okay, and maybe worse. And so that's the argument, and it's not, of course, original to C.S. Lewis. Yeah. It goes way back, earlier than C.S. Lewis.
But I mean, you acknowledged yourself that we all have failings, right? None of us are perfect, and maybe Jesus Christ was a human being who believed really wonderful moral teachings, and he was imperfect. And he decided it would be better for me to say this and try to convince people that this is the right way to live their lives than it would be for me
so
to
he
just...
was a deceiver. That's my way of saying he was a charlatan.
Okay, well, you say it stronger than I do, but in the end, I guess my conclusion is that there is no argument there to say that he is the Son of God.
No, it's not intended to be an argument to prove he was the Son of God. It's intended, and C.S. Lewis states this very, very clearly in the way that he puts forward the argument. It's to say that it's inconsistent to have a position where you say he was not the Son of God, but he was a great moral teacher. And I still think that that's the case. That is inconsistent. He was either the Son of God, or he was at the very least a charlatan, or an evil person, or a complete madman. And that's the nature of the situation. And that doesn't prove that any one of those three options is actually true. It just says you don't have the option of saying he was a wonderful teacher.
I guess I still fundamentally disagree with that, and I
just
thought of a very simple example, like Martin Luther King. Here is a person who is imperfect in various ways, as we all know. However, I think he was a great moral teacher. I think you can be imperfect and still be a great moral teacher.
Okay. Well, we've exercised this one.
Okay.
An area where I thought we disagreed quite noticeably was that you seem to, and I'd like you to clarify this, you seem to be espousing the Dawkins, Dennett position that in the end, religious questions have to be decided by scientific evidence. Okay, you seem to be espousing that, and I wanted to ask you whether you really believe that, or whether, as I've tried to argue, demanding scientific evidence for historical or other claims doesn't seem to be very sensible or consistent.
I completely agree that you cannot answer a historical question using science, because we cannot go back in time and we cannot collect the evidence that we need to collect, and therefore we have to rely on any evidence that we have, which is the historical evidence, and it is a question that we can't therefore decide, any more than I can decide whether or not in that town in India that milk was actually being drunk, because that event has already occurred in the past. So science is limited in its ability to investigate things that happened thousands of years ago. I completely agree with that. But as I said in my comments before, I do believe that the question of whether or not God exists, if you believe that God can impact us, and if you believe that God actually answers prayers, is a scientific hypothesis that can be investigated with science. But
by your own testimony, you had experiences which could easily have been interpreted as the answer to prayer. And you as a child, and this is, I think, true of adults too, not just children, immediately found that it wasn't convincing. And I think that's part of the fundamental problem of people who are asking God to convince me. Why is it that God seems to be so unprovable? Why does God want me to have faith, is one question that people often ask. And I would answer the following. The ways in which God is consistent and acts in reproducible ways are what we call the laws of nature. If you want to find out about a God who is loving and personal, there is no way you can find out that by some kind of reproducible scientific test. If, for example, in a situation, if you pray in such and such a words, something always happens, that would not be a proof of the Christian God. That would be a proof of either magic, or it would be a proof of a new law of nature that we better go out and find out what it is. Okay? And so I think to ask for scientifically provable, demonstrable proofs of the presence of a personal creator is simply a mistake about a fundamental mistake of philosophical requirement. You simply can't prove in that way the presence of a personal God. because if you're asking for reproducible scientific evidence, then science works on the basis of a reproducibility which effectively, by the testimony of many scientists, rules out personality and purpose right from the beginning.
Well, I mean, I don't agree that science automatically rules out purpose. As I mentioned before, although I realize it was a little bit outlandish, I suggested some possible ways that I could be convinced that this God existed. Okay, so I don't think science says right from the start there cannot be a God. God cannot be causing these events to occur. God could not have created this universe. I honestly don't believe that. I honestly believe that most scientists, if they saw some evidence for the fact that God created the universe, or that there was a supernatural being at the start of it all that began the Big Bang, I think scientists would actually accept that, because scientists, that's the scientific method, is trying to understand those things. But
I would argue that science bases its belief on evidence, and the evidence that it accepts as scientific evidence is reproducible phenomena. And when you limit yourself to the ways in which the world, the universe is reproducible, you, by that very act, and this has been stated, in very direct terms by a number of scientists, you very directly rule out explanations in terms of purpose. Scientists deliberately rule out explanations in terms of purpose. Final cause doesn't count as a scientific explanation, right? And so there is a deep sense in which science has deliberately set aside those types of explanations, and therefore suddenly to turn around and say, now show me how God is present, yet within that framework of science which is restricted, which prevents science from addressing certain aspects of the world, I think that's inconsistent.
Well, I just don't see how without science you're going to convince me that I don't have an imaginary friend, for instance, right? I could say I have an imaginary friend, and this imaginary friend interacts with me, and you outside don't see this imaginary friend, and I have a hard time distinguishing between this acceptance of God without any scientific evidence and non-acceptance of my imaginary friend. I don't see that distinction. I did want to add one quote. This is by Albert Einstein, where he said, "All our science, measured against reality, is primitive and childlike, and yet it is the most precious thing we have. It is the most effective way we have found to understand this universe. It's had profound impact on the way we live our lives. Our lifespan is double what it was 1,000 years ago. All the different ways where our lives have been improved so dramatically by science. Science is an incredibly effective. It's not the only way, and I completely agree with you.
That's the most important statement. Okay,
yeah,
it's not the only way.
Okay. I agree. I agree that there are things like love that are very hard to quantify scientifically. I'm not saying that you couldn't do it if you had enough time, energy, variables, understanding of where a person came from, all of their history, but it would be extremely difficult. We are incredibly complicated beings, and something like love is very, very difficult to quantify. But on the other hand, a question about whether or not something exists, I believe, is something that you can actually have a scientific answer to that question.
Okay. How are we doing for time?
Yeah, so I think this would be a perfect time. I'm going to save one question to the end, but let's take some time here to open up the floor and have questions from the floor towards either both of them or either one of them. I would say, would you please keep the questions brief? So what I'll ask you to do is I'll call on you, stand up, say it, I'll repeat it so that the camera can hear.
If you guys were put as the chair of the religion department at a multi-faith community like this, where some people probably want to engage theologically with their own tradition, and some people want to treat religion as an object that they apply critical thinking to, what kind of classes would you guys offer?
So his question was, if they were put as chairs of a religious studies department at a multi-faith community like Williams, how would they handle that?
I think that all chairs of all religious studies places everywhere place emphasis on the academic study of religion rather than on the practice or the development or the promulgation or whatever of religion. I mean, that is simply drawing a distinction between an academic study and the practice. So I mean, I think that's the quick answer. We have chaplains at most universities who have a different job. Their job is to help the people who belong to whatever those communities might be work through and think through and exist in the society they're in. So I don't know whether that's answering your question.
Well, I guess I'm just curious. Like, do you think if the chaplain wants to offer a class in theology, that students should be given the opportunity to receive academic credit for work that they do in theology?
Why not? Many universities, that's kind of automatic. Certainly at Cambridge, where I was an undergraduate, there were plenty of people who majored in theology. I wasn't one of them, thank goodness.
Yeah, I mean, you could ask the same question. Should you allow a mathematician to offer a course on atheism? And I come down on the side of yes on that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right, another question. Why don't we go up here?
So we know that science isn't the only way to explain something, but could we use science to explain religion? It's not the only way, but could we?
So the question is, we know that science isn't the only way to
Explain stuff.
Okay.
It's not the only way to explain stuff, but is it a way?
But
So-
is it a way that we can use to explain religion?
Well, so the claim of the radical atheists, the authors we've been mentioning, the claim of most of them is that science has disproved and has explained religion. So there are two issues. Has science disproved religion? That's one argument that we've been having, or we've been having whether or not there is scientific proof for religion. But the other side of the argument is that they say that religion has been explained by science, and usually what they're referring to here are evolutionary psychology and sociobiological explanations of religion. Many people have been offering those explanations. There may be some truth in some of those explanations of religion, although they seem to be all over the place and many of them very contradictory, so they can't all be true, despite the great confidence which they're often offered. But my comment would be, even if there were some kind of natural explanation of the religious impulse, which I think there probably is, okay? It doesn't answer the question of whether that religious impulse is directed towards something that's actually there or not. So it sort of leaves open the real question of whether the object of faith is a reality or not. So explaining psychology can't give you the answers, in my view, to questions like that. Maybe you want to pick that one up.
I completely agree that I think scientists and evolutionary biologists and others have come up with a lot of explanations as to why the religious impulse exists, and I personally find them somewhat convincing. But I completely agree also that talking about that does not answer a question of whether or not what those impulses are directed at exists. I completely agree with that.
Do you think there are any moral acts that an atheist could do because of his disbelief?
Moral acts what?
That an atheist could not do because of his disbelief?
Are there any moral acts that an atheist cannot do because of his disbelief?
I'm happy to take this one. Yeah, no, I think atheism, if you're an atheist, if you do not believe in God, then you do not believe that there is some supreme being which is telling you what's right and wrong. And therefore, you have to figure out what's right and wrong. And I think I'm a very moral individual because I think hard about what is right and wrong, and I come to conclusions based on what I see around me, based on the fact that I think I should be empathetic to others, that I don't want to hurt others, I don't want to be hurt by them, I don't want to hurt them, I want to live in a world where we get along really well, I don't want to see other people suffer. All of those things are things that developed within me, not because someone else said, you have to believe this, but because I honestly believe it myself. I came to those conclusions myself. So I think that, and it's not always true, Professor Hutchinson is exactly right in that if you are an atheist, you can potentially do horrible things. The same is true of a theist. The same is true of anyone who believes in God. They can do horrible things too. It's what you do individually and the conclusions you come to that matter. And I think as an atheist, you tend to think a lot harder about what is right and wrong because there's nobody who's telling you what's right and wrong. You have to figure it out for yourself.
I don't think that's true. The last part of it, anyway. Much of the first part, I do agree with. I certainly think that Christians, theists, and atheists can all be good, and do evil. I don't think it's the case that being an atheist makes you more moral. I think that's a fallacy. And one of the problems I have, and this comes back to something you said earlier, is that to found your ethics and morality on something as elementary as saying that I should avoid suffering is unfortunately insufficient. It cannot answer the really hard questions. Of course, we should not impose suffering on others. And I, as a Christian believer, would echo that. But it's insufficient in and of itself. In particular, for example, if you say that the guiding light of morality and ethics is to avoid giving rise to suffering, then you cannot argue effectively against, for example, euthanasia in any situation with sufficient warrant for it, or even in situations where there are no warrants for it, because death is presumably not suffering, and so the termination of a life is not forbidden by an ethics that is purely founded on suffering. So unfortunately, while it sounds like a good thing, it's actually insufficient for real ethics. Now, I'm not saying that I'm an expert in ethics, but I'll put that one out for you. Maybe you have a response.
I think you're absolutely right that it shouldn't just be based on avoiding suffering because of the example that you just gave. That clearly, killing people because they have a splinter would be silly. But I think if you try to, number one, avoid suffering, number two, help people as much as you can to achieve happiness, then in some sense you are protected against euthanasia because those people don't want to die. They want to live their lives as fully as they can. And honestly, if somebody is suffering horribly and they would like to die, unfortunately, oftentimes religion doesn't allow them to do so, whereas I would argue that people under those circumstances should have the right to terminate their lives or to have someone terminate it for them if they're incapable of doing it. So maybe we just disagree on that particular issue.
As you said, we don't have a time machine, we can't go back in time. So doesn't that mean that belief in the theory of evolution is comparable to belief in religion?
She said, as they've both agreed, we don't have a time machine, you can't go back in time, so does that mean that belief in a theory such as evolution is comparable to a belief in religion?
It may short-circuit the argument if I say, I don't think so. I think that the basis for holding that the diversity of biological life arose predominantly by common descent through evolution it is in fact a scientific question. It can in fact be addressed through the methods of science because it's a question about nature, or to a certain degree a question about natural history, but it's one that does lend itself quite well to science. And I, for one, think that the evidence in favor of it is actually rather strong. But then I also think the evidence for Christianity is quite strong.
Yeah, no comment. I mean, I think that the evidence for evolution is incredibly strong, and it's a very different kind of an event than whether or not Christ was resurrected. And knowing whether or not Christ was resurrected is something that, unless we could go back in a time machine and see it, we cannot get that evidence. Whereas determining that evolution occurred by seeing in the strata the fossils that demonstrate that various animals and species have evolved over time, there is a means for actually obtaining evidence in that case.
I think we have time for two more. I'm going to go right here in the red.
I don't know if I'm paraphrasing correctly, but Professor Hutchinson seemed to indicate that the intangible love is sort of the measure for Christianity. So my question for both of you is, how do you measure that or other intangibles in people who are non-Christian? And how does that account for the measure of Christianity?
I'll let you.
How do I measure it? I don't often measure it, is the bottom line. And in a way, I would say, I mean, I don't want to try to twist your question. I'd like to answer it as directly as I can, but it seems like asking for some kind of quantitative evaluation of love seems kind of strange to me. I don't know how to do it, and I don't think we can evaluate love scientifically. That's what I would say.
I'd just like to ask you a question, actually, which is that's related to this question, which is, you know, when a little girl is born into a Hindu family in India and has no access to Christianity or what you consider to be the true word, and therefore has no access to this true love with God, lives out her life and then passes on and still doesn't get that opportunity. I mean, how does that work in relation to your belief of this God who wants to allow people to experience this love?
I think Christians take that question very seriously, and that's one reason why Christians have always seen as part of their mission to reach out to others and tell them about what the reality that they have found. The completeness with which they're successful in doing that is obviously far from complete. But I would say that's one of the impulses that Christians have. Of course, your question is a much bigger question. You're really asking, is God fair? I'm not sure I could start on that one right now, but I think that's a very important question.
One more. Why don't we go here in the back? Final question, yeah.
Both of you tonight have mentioned some historical evidence as to the truth or not of the resurrection, and I was just wondering what standards or criteria might you impose for evaluating the validity of historical evidence?
So the question is, both of them have mentioned the claim of the resurrection of Jesus. By what criteria would they measure whether or not that is true or untrue?
Since this is getting close to the end, I would, if I can go first, since it sort of was, maybe it's my issue. I would say this: you have to live your life one way or the other. Science prefers to put off decisions about truth, falsehood, about models, about the realities of nature until all the evidence is in. But we as individuals have to live our lives taking decisions without all the evidence, without all the knowledge, every day and every week and every month and every year. And I think that this is one of those situations. It's not, I don't for a moment argue that there is some kind of absolute proof from history or from science or anything else of the reality of the Christian faith. But I do think there's good evidence. And ultimately, you have to make a decision about what you will live by. And that's the other sense in which Christianity is about faith. Christians are in general people who have said, I am going to live my life in the light of the love that I believe is shown in Jesus Christ. And that's the sense in which faith is a commitment. I believe we have to make those commitments, whatever our theological or atheistical positions are, and we have to live by them.
I would say, with respect to the resurrection of Jesus Christ, I mean, that is an incredibly extraordinary claim, right? As you said, nobody else is making that claim. This is a very unusual, very extraordinary claim. And as such, it should require an extraordinary amount of evidence to convince anyone that that actually happened. Now, the kind of evidence that you were talking about earlier, about the fact that there are certain people who've seen this and who claim that it was true, we have all kinds of events, as I mentioned before, in history that we also found to be outlandish, that we had similar claims of eyewitnesses who were arguing that they had evidence that they actually saw this happen. Hundreds of people, thousands of people sometimes, who claim to have seen these miracles. And so for me, I would need really good evidence, really strong evidence to convince me that the resurrection actually occurred. And unfortunately, I don't see any way that that's ever going to happen given where we are now 2,000 years later.
So unfortunately, we've run out of time for questions, but I would imagine these guys would be happy to stick around for a few minutes afterwards if you'd like to ask them a question. As we said also, and these two are going to come up and say a little bit more about. On Monday, there'll be opportunity for follow-up discussions, so please strongly consider coming to that. Somewhat in line with what the follow-up discussion at least has something to do with. Professor Adams, what would it require for you to move from your position to a belief in God, or perhaps all the way to Professor Hutchinson's position of being a Christian? And Professor Hutchinson, what would it take for you to no longer be a Christian, and perhaps even to move as far as Professor Adams and to actually be an atheist? So what would that take? And also, in that, if you'd like to make one kind of summary closing point before we have these guys come up to close us.
Okay. Is that okay if I go first here? Yeah. Okay. So I think I already explained in my talk earlier that there are things that could convince me otherwise. That I like to think of myself as a logical person. I like to think that the beliefs that I have are based on evidence, or based on logically applying rules to that set of evidence, and then coming to conclusions based on that. So there are situations I can imagine, and I mentioned some of them before, if there were actually studies coming out, and they'd have to be very convincing studies, and there'd have to be a lot of them, but studies coming out that demonstrated the efficacy of prayer. That would really get me thinking very seriously. And if it turned out, as I mentioned before, that Christians somehow, their prayers were answered all the time and nobody else's were, that would be another reason why I would suddenly think, gee, maybe this Christianity thing has something going for it, and I would take it very seriously. But I don't expect that's going to happen. I hope I remain open-minded, and I want to continue discussions with people here, and I really have enjoyed talking with Professor Hutchinson about this, and I do understand, why you feel the way you do, and I understand that people can have different perspectives, and I've enjoyed tonight, so thanks.
Yeah, I likewise think it would be most unlikely. Okay, but I do think that if, there's a simple answer to the question. If by some strange manner, extremely convincing evidence came to light, or someone talked about a time machine earlier, if a time machine became available whereby we could go back to the 1st century and it demonstrated unequivocally, that no, Jesus didn't rise from the dead, he was still in the tomb, or the disciples stole him away, or whatever it was, that would be sufficient. That's my answer to your question. I'd like to also echo the remarks of Professor Adams. I've enjoyed being with you all very much. I think a civil discussion like this is extremely valuable. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I just want to thank you very much for the privilege of being with you. Thank you very much.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.